The Sickness Unto Death was published in 1849, just 6 years before Kierkegaard's death in 1855. It is one of Kierkegaard's last philosophical works, and the pseudonym he writes under in this book is Anti-Climacus. In The Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard says that despair is the sickness unto death. Human beings are a synthesis of spiritual and physical elements, and despair is a misrelation between these elements. The solution to despair is a condition in which the individual has established a relationship with the power that established it, in other words, with God. People may appear to despair over facts of the world, but despair is in fact always an internal problem for which the individual is personally responsible. In the preface, Kierkegaard apologizes that some readers may find his book strange, since it appears to lack the seriousness one would presumably expect from a book on spiritual matters. However, it is in fact scholarly treatments that lack the appropriate manner. Whereas science and scholarship provide information about history, about the world of objects and facts, Christianity is concerned with the spiritual well-being of individual human beings. Christian writing should therefore speak directly to the individual, even if this means adopting a less formal style. Christian writing should adopt the manner of a physician at a sickbed. Despair is the sickness in question, and the cure for despair is to die unto the world, that is, to adopt a spiritual outlook. Now, the irony and sarcasm of the preface is typical of Kierkegaard's writing style. Rather than make straightforward arguments in support of his position, he often proceeds by ridiculing opposing views. Some people have argued that the format of The Sickness Unto Death, its complex structure of parts and sections and subsections, its many definitions and categories, is meant to be an elaborate parody of Hegel and other philosophers who think that philosophy can use precise terms and concepts to develop a complete picture of the world. According to this interpretation, Kierkegaard's writing is meant to show us that rational analysis and interpretation cannot always provide clear answers. In the Bible, Christ raises Lazarus from the dead. Christ teaches us that physical death is not the end of life. Whereas sickness, death, and earthly suffering may seem awful to non-Christians, to Christians they are but temporary inconveniences on the way to salvation and eternal life. Christians, however, must face a deeper fear than the fear of death. They may fear that their faith is not sufficient to bring them eternal life. This deeper fear is the true sickness unto death. The introduction expands on the themes of the preface, offering some suggestion of what Kierkegaard means by despair, as well as some explanation of how Kierkegaard interprets Christ's teaching of the resurrection. Christians are aware of the teaching of eternal life. According to Kierkegaard, this knowledge frees them from the earthly cares and concerns that afflict non-Christians. However, just as it makes them aware of the possibility of eternal happiness, so does it also create the possibility of a deeper unhappiness or despair. They may worry that their faith in God is not strong enough to bring them eternal life. This relationship between Christianity and despair is a good example of dialectics. Kierkegaard implies that there is a dialectical balance between happiness and unhappiness. The pagan or non-Christian enjoys earthly pleasures that are balanced by the earthly fear of sickness and death. The Christian enjoys higher spiritual pleasures, including anticipation of eternal life. But these higher pleasures bring about a higher fear, the fear that one will suffer an eternal death and not enjoy eternal pleasures. Kierkegaard says that a human being is a self which relates itself to itself and which has been established by another. Two forms of despair are possible for such selves: despair not to will to be oneself and despair to will to be oneself. The final paragraph of Part 1AA defines the condition of a self that is not in despair as a condition in which the self, in relating to itself and willing to be itself, develops a transparent relationship with the power that established it. Kierkegaard is saying that human beings are a synthesis of the infinite and finite, temporal and eternal, and freedom and necessity. Kierkegaard is arguing that human beings are both physical and spiritual. We live in a world of material things and physical forces, a world of causes and effects. Yet we also have a spiritual identity and feel as though we can make free choices. Thus, we are both a physical body and a spiritual identity, and we are also the complex relationship between these two things. To paraphrase Kierkegaard, we are a relation that relates itself to itself. Kierkegaard's account of despair is based on this account of what a human being is. He argues that despair is a sort of imbalance or misrelationship in this body or spirit relationship. He also suggests that despair is a sort of defiance in which a human being either does not want to be what it is or wants to be something it is not. These two definitions may seem different, but they are related. According to Kierkegaard, a human being is a combination of spirit and body. Thus, if a human being does not want to be what it is, then it must want to neglect some aspect of its spirit body relationship. He offers two examples of despair. The first example is a person who wants to be Caesar but fails to accomplish this goal. This person appears to be despairing over something, over not being Caesar. In fact, however, he is despairing over himself. He wishes that he were something that he is not, and he wishes that he were not himself, since he is not Caesar. The second example makes the same point. A girl whose lover has died or has betrayed her may appear to be despairing over the lover, but in fact she despairs over herself. She wishes that she were still her lover's beloved. This is what Kierkegaard means when he says that despair is an internal problem for which individuals themselves are responsible. Though the girl and the man who wants to be Caesar appear to be frustrated by the circumstances of their lives, they are in fact frustrated with themselves. The same can be said of the despairing Christians who were described in the preface and introduction. Their despair over the possibility of an eternal death is really a frustration with themselves, a frustration with their failure to attain eternal life. Further, he says that despair is at once a distinction and a curse. Despair is a distinction because it is possible only for spiritual beings. It is not possible for animals which do not have free spirits, nor for the non-Christians of the distant past who were not aware of themselves as free spirits that could attain eternal life. Nevertheless, despair is a condition of awful unhappiness and frustration. All people are in despair unless they are true Christians, and true Christians, Kierkegaard says, are very rare. This is not a depressing thought. Rather, the universality of despair indicates that spirituality is a universal quality of human beings. People may be in despair even if they are not aware that they are in despair. People may be ill but have symptoms only a physician would recognize. Similarly, people may be in despair and not know it. Most people go through life concerned only with petty physical and material cares. Yet whether or not one is in despair is the only question of eternal significance. Then Kierkegaard categorizes the forms of despair. Despair may be analyzed abstractly by looking at the elements of the concept of despair. However, whether or not the individual is conscious of despair is the principal distinction between forms of despair. He notes that human beings are a synthesis of the infinite and the finite. The human self overcomes despair by becoming itself, which means establishing the appropriate form of the synthesis of infinite and finite. This is possible only through God. He describes the condition of despair in which the individual focuses on the infinite and neglects the finite. This form of despair occurs when the individual becomes absorbed in fantasies. He further describes another condition of despair in which the individual focuses on the finite and neglects the infinite. A person suffering from this form of despair becomes overly absorbed in practical earthly matters such as business and social life. Now, a belief that for God all things are possible may enable people to avoid despair and hopelessness even when crushed by the most awful circumstances. Fatalism, by contrast, presumes that events in the world are predetermined as a result of physical forces and cause-effect relationships. Similarly, some people concern themselves exclusively with petty matters and accept turns of events in the world without emotion or resistance. Both fatalism and philistinism cannot protect individuals from despair as faith can. There is a hierarchy of forms of despair. The more conscious one is of one's despair, the more intense the despair is. Ignorant despair is the despair of not knowing that one is in despair. This is the most common form of despair. It is the natural state of all pagans. or non-Christians, and others who fail to concern themselves with spiritual matters. Such people are naturally defensive when they are told that they are in despair. Nevertheless, it may be easier for them to overcome despair than it is for people with a deeper awareness of their despair. Further, the consciousness of despair varies according to both how aware one is of one's own despair and to how aware one is of what it means to be in despair. Pagans, for instance, may feel that they are in despair, but they cannot be fully conscious of the depth of their despair since they are not aware of Christian teachings of salvation. He then describes despair in weakness, alternatively defined as the despair of not wanting to be oneself. In this form of despair, individuals lose the desire to be who they are. These individuals fall into two categories. First, there are those who are focused on earthly events and circumstances and fall into despair because of some aspect of their earthly lives. These people do not want to be themselves because they wish their lives had turned out differently. Second, there are those who are aware of spiritual possibilities but refuse to pursue them. These people are more conscious of themselves and of despair. They do not wish to be themselves because they feel unwilling or unable to focus on spiritual matters, even though they know that it is weak to be focused on earthly events. Lastly, there is the despair of defiance, alternatively defined as the despair of wanting to be oneself. In this form of despair, the individual wishes to be the complete master of his or her destiny, which of course is impossible. This form of despair is demonic. Now, Kierkegaard says that it is sin to be in despair before God or with the conception of God. Being before God changes the types of despair described earlier in the book. Just as people experience more intense despair when they are aware of despair, so do people experience more intense despair when they measure their condition according to God's standards rather than human standards. Likewise, just there is a hierarchy of forms of despair. So is there a hierarchy of sins, ranging from sins of the flesh to more spiritual forms of revolt against God. Nevertheless, the definition of sin as despair before God can account for all particular sins, since it captures sin's fundamental form. Kierkegaard says that faith is a state of being oneself and wanting to be oneself while maintaining a relationship with God. Thus, the opposite of sin is faith, not virtue. He then explores the definition of sin put forward by the Greek philosopher Socrates, who argued that sin is ignorance. This definition is inferior to the Christian understanding of sin. The definition of Socrates appears to leave many questions unanswered. For instance, it suggests that it is impossible for someone to know what they should do and yet willfully do something else. Although Socrates is laudable, Christianity has improved on his thinking in that Christianity recognizes that there is a difference between knowing what to do and actually doing it. Socrates presumed that if someone commits a wrong, they must not have known what was right. Christianity recognizes that people can do what is wrong even though they know what is right. Further, it recognizes that they can willfully refuse even to try to know what is right. Christ's teachings have revealed to people what is right, yet people may refuse to follow Christ's teaching. He explains that sin is not a negation but a position. That is to say, sin is not merely the absence of virtue but rather a distinct state of being, a condition that human beings willfully take on. Theologians who try to understand sin and other religious concepts in rational terms are mistaken. The essence of Christianity is that God has revealed to human beings that they are living in sin and that faith is the only way to overcome sin. Kierkegaard's argument that sin is a position recalls Kierkegaard's earlier suggestion that people are responsible for the condition of sinfulness. For Kierkegaard, sin is the condition of rejecting Christ's teaching and failing to pursue faith. It is the condition of remaining in despair even after Christ has shown us how despair may be overcome. Kierkegaard's point is that this condition involves much more than simply failing to live virtuously. It involves a willful refusal to accept Christian truth.